Hello and welcome to Reporting In. I am your host, Malcolm Fleschner, and this is today we're going to do part two, essentially, of a two-part series on Project Censored. If you watched last week's episode, then you know I was interviewing Andy Lee Roth, who is involved in Project Censored. And this is a group that collaborates to come up with the 25 biggest stories of the year that got the least coverage but deserved more. And we went into it and discussed in some detail last week how the stories are chosen, why these stories typically are not covered as much as they should be, and some of the other operating principles that in how the organization operates and chooses them, and basically how the corporate media work. I was chastised for calling it the mainstream media when I should be calling it the corporate media. I'm sorry. I will try to do better. But see, you're already having an effect. If you thought that the past 32 years since 1976 when it was founded, Andy,
40 some years.
Yeah. If you thought you had no effect whatsoever, here's proof to the contrary. So there's that at least. But so this week, I wanted to talk to Andy. Thank you for coming back.
Yes, wonderful
Appreciate
to
it.
be back again.
Making the time again for me. And we both were we liked what we were wearing last week so much we both wore the same thing. And so what I wanted to get into this week is to talk about some of the stories that were chosen by Project Censored this year as among the top 25. We don't have time to get into all of them, but I thought we could at least discuss a few of them. One of them, let's start with this one. The world's richest 1% continue to become wealthier. So this is. The story is essentially about how the world's richest people have seen their share of the globe's total wealth increase from 42.5% at the height of the financial crisis in 2008 to more than 50% today. And so it's just the wealth is concentrating more and more and more at the top, and the bottom half or the bottom 99% or whatever, however you want to frame it, is getting less and less of the pie. And how do you determine a story like this merits inclusion when it's not like a news story, it's not like a plane crash or a hurricane, or even a situation like Flint, Michigan, that we find out about? This is just an ongoing creeping story that is just worsening and worsening and worsening, and so it doesn't fit into a news hole as easily as other stories might.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, this isn't a dramatic single instance. It's not like there was an event, a catastrophic event that suddenly led to 1% controlling more than 50.1% of the world's wealth. And that's one of the reasons I think that this story did not garner very much coverage whatsoever in the corporate media. But that's still an interesting puzzle, because the facts that you mentioned, the change from 2008, when it was approximately 42% of the world's wealth controlled by the top 1%, to 2017, where it's now over half, was a finding from a specific study, the Credit Suisse report, big international bank that monitors these things. And just to put a little more context on that 50.1% figure, what we're talking about there is somewhere around $140 trillion in wealth. And again, to kind of put those almost impossible to comprehend large numbers into perspective, the number of millionaires has, since 2000, the number of millionaires in the world has tripled. And there now are approximately 36 million millionaires in the country. I mention that figure because it's important to contrast it with the 3.5 billion people whose wealth amounts to less than $10,000. So a part of this Credit Suisse report that was picked up and reported by The Guardian out of the UK was that 70% of the world's working age population control less than 3% of the world's wealth. So, as you point out, this is in effect a story about an ongoing trend. But when you break it down and start thinking about the number of people involved and what it would mean to live on, less than $10,000 a year, in many places around the world, and in many cases, the poverty is even more extraordinary than that. This is the story of literally billions of people's lives, and it's not deemed newsworthy.
Yeah.
So, and when I say it's not deemed newsworthy, again, I can point to a study from the year 2014 by Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, where they looked at, I think it was like 14 months of nightly primetime television news coverage, the big ABC, CBS, NBC shows. And what they found was that in the average 22-minute broadcast, it's less than half an hour because of all the advertising, all the corporate advertising, we might add. In the average 22-minute broadcast, about 2.7 seconds per broadcast was devoted to talking about poverty and people in poverty. And so this is an aspect of this story that Project Censored has been tracking for quite some time now. The disproportionate amount of coverage given by the corporate press to wealthy people, right, compared to the vast majority of the world that is not not part of that $140 trillion of collective wealth.
Well, I mean, realistically though, the people with making $10,000 a year, or who are living in grinding poverty, are not going to be buying, a new Dodge Stratus, which is what being advertised. So it makes financial sense for them not to. It wouldn't make good financial sense for them to cover those stories, and that's part of the systemic problem that you talked about on yesterday or last week's episode. Yesterday, where did I get yesterday?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. But then that raises the really fundamental question about the lack of fit between news that is built on a for-profit model and our cherished notions of news as what we need to know to be engaged community members and participants in democratic self-government.
Right. The press is the only profession mentioned in the United States Constitution, and there is a responsibility of the news media to create or generate an informed electorate so that we can make decisions in a democratic society. And when their decisions are being made based on the profit motive instead of informing the citizenry, those are really at odds. So it's understandable why they wouldn't cover those stories. Because they can make an argument that their audience isn't really concerned about those stories. The next story I want to talk about is the headline. And these stories, our viewers can find out more about all these stories at Project Censored's website, projectcensored.org, and find out about the original reporting, often from independent media sources. But the headline is, "How Big Wireless Convinced Us Cell Phones and Wi-Fi Are Safe." And I read some of the original reporting. I remember reading about this story in The Nation last March, and I was surprised to discover that the major telecom industry that profits off of cell phones and Wi-Fi and our modern communications technology, that they have essentially followed the model of the tobacco industry and the oil industry vis-a-vis climate change, in just sowing doubt about any research that suggests that cell phones and the wireless world we live in might be giving us cancer, might be dangerous to pregnant women and all that sort of thing. That seems like the kind of sensational story that you would think that even the corporate media would go for, because they love scare tactics. They love is your detergent killing you? Tune in be sure to stay tuned to find out. So why don't stories like that get covered based on your model?
Yeah. Before addressing that question, I want to actually just quote a little bit from that Nation report. Mark Hertsgaard and Mark Dowie, in their report on this topic, they say, over the past 30 years, billions of people around the world have been subjected to a massive public health experiment. Use a cell phone today, find out later if it causes cancer or genetic damage. And I'll skip ahead a little bit. This public health experiment has been conducted without the informed consent of its subjects. So and they document this quite thoroughly in their report. And that report is not the only one that we, Project Censored, feature in this kind of cluster of stories on cell phones and wireless, Wi-Fi technologies. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But insofar as we're talking about corporate interests and we're talking about an absence of corporate media, again, I don't want to turn it into a just so story. Why isn't this covered? But the financial interests are there. Who are the advertisers? Who are the investors in these corporate media news outlets? And but as you say, they've been quite sophisticated. Big telecom has been quite sophisticated in, what they call wargaming the research on this, either discrediting research that shows there are dangers and oftentimes funding research of their own to show that there are not.
Right, and then and I'm sure when the few opportunities or the few times that the corporate media does cover it, or attempts to cover it in a fair fashion and say that these risks are legitimate, then the response from industry is so vociferous, and I'm sure they put on a full-on blitz that whoever okayed that coverage gets the message, like, okay, this is not worth the trouble.
And this is a case where I think it is worth getting into the weeds a little bit on the details of this story. The other component to this story is a study that was published in, I believe it was December of 2017 in Scientific Reports. This was a massive study of hundreds of pregnant women in the San Francisco Bay Area, controlled research looking at their exposure to magnetic field radiation, which is the radiation associated with cell phones. And what they found was that women with regular levels of exposure, regular meaning what we would associate with normal usage of a cellular device, were 2.7 times more likely to miscarry than those with lower levels of exposure. Now, I mentioned that detail because that's exactly the kind of point that the big telecom has attempted to kind of put the thumb on the scale. The point of this study was that they were examining MF exposure based on how normal, ordinary people actually use their phones. Mm-hmm. The scientific research that is touted by the big telecom companies to suggest there's no danger is derived from basically sort of like lab setting versions of everyday life, where somehow I would be talking to you on my cell phone, holding it at arm's length from my head, and therefore I'm not getting the same level of exposure that I will have when I hold it the way most people do, right next to their ear, or
in your pocket, or
exactly
wherever, in your bra. I wear mine in my bra frequently. So that's
right.
But the point is they create these studies with they know what they know what the outcome they want is, and even if they don't get it, they probably just scrap the study and try another one. So they can point to something and say, oh no, they're wrong. But it's the news media's job in that situation to suss out the truth for us, not to say he said this, she said that. They said it was raining, they said it was sunny. Who knows? I don't know. I'm not here to judge. I'm not here to get at the truth. I just tell you what they say. So, and the telecom industry, based on what the tobacco industry has done with lung cancer and the research into the dangers of smoking, and the fossil fuel industries have done with climate change, all they need to do is sow that doubt. And they know they can take advantage of this model that the news media use of he said, she said, and I'm just in between here to let you decide the truth for yourself. They can weaponize that, just like Donald Trump weaponizing fake news.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, it's extraordinarily frustrating, and they shouldn't go along with it. But of course, that's all. If they didn't, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Project Censored wouldn't exist, and so on and so forth. So I guess at least we get. That's why we get to talk about it. So let's move on to the next story I wanted to talk about, which I think is really compelling. Also, was number 5 on your list. Was Washington Post bans employees from using social media to criticize sponsors? And can you tell me about what this is an individual story that broke, and the opportunity to cover it widely was certainly there when the story broke, and yet the corporate media essentially ignored it. Can you tell me a little bit more about this story?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite stories from this year's list for exactly those reasons, Malcolm. A lot of people over the years will say to me when I'm speaking about Project Censored, or will hear at a public event, "Oh, censorship! There's no censorship in the United States. We have a free press," and that is a rich opportunity to talk about the links between censorship and propaganda. And yes, it's true. We in terms of a kind of an old-fashioned model of gatekeeping, at most places in the country, there's not a gatekeeper who says you can't report that, you can't say that, the public is not allowed to hear that. But a story like this reminds us that sometimes good old-fashioned gatekeeping is, most of the time in the United States, I believe censorship operates in much more subtle and sophisticated ways, and it manifests as propaganda and slant of the sort we were talking about last week. But what this number 5 story about the Washington Post's ban is a nice reminder that we're not immune to this here in the United States, even with the First Amendment and so forth. Because the First Amendment, of course, specifically prohibits government censorship. But this is a case of the Washington Post, a news outlet, restricting the speech of its employees. So specifically, and it's worth noting here, this story was broken in June of 2017 by Andrew Bajon, reporting for the Washingtonian. And at the time he reported, it wasn't clear how long the Washington Post policy had already been in effect, but it was definitely in effect at the time he reported. No employees were allowed to use their social media in ways that would, quote, adversely affect the Washington Post's advertisers, customers, vendors, etc. And if a Washington Post employee was found to be using their own, and these are their personal social media accounts, not just their not their Washington Post email address or something, their personal accounts. If they were found to be using their social media in ways that, again, adversely affected the Post's customers, clients, advertisers, etc., they could be fired. The policy also suggested, as the Washingtonian reported, that Washington Post employees ought to snitch on one another if they knew of other employees doing that.
There's a healthy workplace environment for you, where you have to worry if you complain that your United Airlines flight was an hour late and they didn't tell you anything about it and didn't know what was going to happen. You complain about it, and one of your coworkers sees that and tells management, "Hey, doesn't United Airlines advertise with us?" I mean, this is what a horrible atmosphere that you're creating.
Yeah, I mean, this is an atmosphere for self-censorship and all the chilling consequences of a policy like that. So it gets a little more pointed if we go one more round with this. As a reporter at the Mint Press News, Whitney Webb did, she noted that, of course, as is I think reasonably well known now, that Jeff Bezos, who purchased the Washington Post not so long ago, is, of course, the CEO of Amazon. And not long after he had purchased the Post, Amazon cut a $600 million contract with the CIA for web hosting services. So Whitney Webb began to question, well, how might that work? There seems to be kind of what she described as a loophole that any company that might wish to avoid criticism in the Post could simply take advertising with it. Now, a number of former Washington Post reporters said that they didn't believe that criticizing the CIA would technically be prohibited under the new company policy. But again, what we're talking about here is a kind of chilling effect.
Yeah, why take the chance, though? Why chance? It's better not to risk it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So I think this is and this story, it's quite amazing. So you would think a story about one of the major newspapers in the country putting basically a kind of gag order on its employees would be a rather newsworthy event. At the time, as Censored 2019 went to press, we had done extensive review of this story, looking for corporate coverage, and we found 2 instances of it. About a month after the original story broke, the Fox Business News ran a hard-hitting 74-second, I'm joking, a hard-hitting 74-second report more than a month after the story broke, where the anchor noted that, well, they were in tricky territory when they got to free speech issues. And the other was an editorial that ran in the Wall Street Journal. So this story is basically invisible in the corporate press.
And the crazy thing, or in some regard, is that the press loves to cover itself. I mean, this is a story about themselves, and typically those types of stories just get much too much coverage because they're about things that these people understand and care about, and affects their day-to-day operations potentially. But here we have an example where maybe it's the kind of thing that management doesn't want the public to know, that we are not just operating with self-censorship, but literally censoring you and threatening you with being fired if all you do is go on social media and say, Tide says they get my white's whiter and my color's brighter, but they don't. And then, oh no, sorry, they're an advertiser. You're gone. Yeah. I mean, it's preposterous, and so you don't do it. I mean, I have a colleague here at the Young Turks named Jimmy Dore, who was criticized by Dave Weigel in the Washington Post. If he had only known that all he needed to do was take out an ad in the Washington Post and then they would leave him alone, he could have saved himself a lot of trouble.
Yep.
All right, so we're almost, I'm sorry, there's so many more stories I wanted to talk to you about, the $21 trillion that the government has lost, and how Russiagate, how the craziness of Russiagate, and how that's a super overcovered story, but it's actually undercovered in terms of getting the facts behind. It's the kind of thing where you don't even have to prove anything anymore. You can just say Russia, and everybody just runs for the hills. So, but we don't have time, unfortunately. I really would like to, but I want to encourage people to go to projectcensored.org and check out these stories, find out more about why these are censored stories, how the news media, the corporate news media in the United States operates. Before I go, I wanted to ask you, in addition to projectcensored.org, Andy, where else would you recommend people pursue? Of course, the Young Turks, naturally. But what are the other news outlets or the media outlets that you would encourage people to explore? Because one of the things you talk about is that the solution to the problem is not fact checkers for the Washington Post or things like that. It's a better informed populace, and people need to take into their own hands the information, the news that they gather. And where can they go besides projectcensored.org? Where would you recommend people seek out information?
Yeah, I think one way to begin is to just look at our top 25 list, which is not only published in the book each year, but I think we talked last week about the archive of all the top 25 lists the project has put together over the years, and you could look for each of those stories we give a full citation, and if it's online, a live link to the original source. And so you could look at the citations for those stories and see some of the news outlets that we keep track of and that we're grateful to for bringing these stories forward. On a personal level, my initial interest in the kind of the sociological question of how news stories are constructed goes back to the work of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, FAIR. And I think they're a wonderful source. And I would give a shout out to an organization that probably maybe not as many people will know, called The Weave News, which is John Collins back on the East Coast, a great outlet. And then, I think all the time of Manar Muawesh at Mint Press News, and Abby Martin, Breaking the Set. You mentioned Russiagate briefly. Both Abby and Manar have been, part of a kind of dragnet as a result of Russiagate furor,
right?
And Mint Press News and Breaking the Set, which is on RT America. Journalists from RT America had to register as foreign agents with the U.S. Department of Justice as a result of some of the fears over Russiagate.
Abby has been, her Empire Files show has been drummed out of because of fear mongering about Venezuela, and so Telesur, and that's a separate issue we can get into. I would add Consortium News. Robert Perry founded, was a great organization. They still do great work. And Aaron Matei is mentioned in the Russiagate story, who is with the Real News. So there are a lot of outlets that are doing great work and help the average American who it shouldn't be, the burden shouldn't be on Americans to have to examine the news that they receive with such a jaundiced eye, but it's important to learn what the alternatives are and to have that perspective when you do read the Washington Post and the New York Times and we watch CNN and MSNBC to understand that they're giving you news, but it's one version of the news, and there are a lot of stories they aren't covering, and the stories they're covering they're only going to cover in a certain way.
Yeah, I mean the metaphor that I think in terms of is a food metaphor, and the corporate media are in this metaphor kind of like the fast food restaurants that are so prevalent in so many communities, and it's easily accessible and relatively cheap, but it's not necessarily good for you. Or if you know about alternatives, it's not actually necessarily that satisfying. And then I think of independent news media as being more like the local organic farmers who bring their wares to a community market. It's a little harder to find. You have to break old habits to realize how good it is. But, there is, I think, more high quality independent news reporting in the US now than there has ever been. And the trick, I think, is to have people not turn away from it because either they're so disillusioned about the political process or journalism altogether that they simply have retreated into the kind of their own little barriered world, or the other fallout kind of the fake news, the weaponization of this notion of fake news. They just believe, oh, it's all partisan and none of it is actually factually based or have any kind of independent anchoring in reality. And that's simply not true. I believe that both of those are actually excuses not to pay attention. And I think a lot about the Ray Bradbury classic Fahrenheit 451 and the themes in that book, where the famous lead character comes home from work one day after he's seen and done something that conflict with his morals, and he's distressed. And his partner is glued to the multi-screens on all their walls, and she doesn't want to be bothered. And he says to her, we need to be bothered once in a while. We need to be bothered. Well, that message is maybe a little different, plays a little differently now when we have a president who regularly villainizes the journalism as the enemy of the people and so forth. We know we're bothered, but we can't allow ourselves to disengage because of that. And so, Peter Phillips, the former director of the project, would always talk about how one of the aims of the project was to cultivate people's interest in and desire for high quality independent news. And I always remember that when I talk with my students, and I guess I'm doing it now on this program, that one of the things about looking to independent news, going back to my food metaphor, is that it's simply more palatable. And you'll feel better if you consume it rather than the corporate alternative.
All right. Well, I appreciate your leaving us on an optimistic note and also maybe making me a little bit hungry. Thank you so much for talking to me. Andy Lee Roth, it's projectcensored.org. I really encourage viewers, the people watching this show probably are already interested in independent media and pursuing alternatives, but I appreciate your watching and for taking an interest, and hope that you learned something. I certainly have from Andy, and it's really valuable, the work you're doing. So thank you so much, Andy, and thanks for talking to me today.
Thank
the rest
you, Malcolm.
of you,
it's my pleasure.
Great. Thank you for watching. Hope you'll stay tuned for next week. We're going to have another great episode of Reporting In. But for now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.